A young university student went out for a bike ride one afternoon, but she never returned home. What started as a missing person case quickly turned into one of the largest search operations the city had ever witnessed, drawing national attention and leaving investigators scrambling for answers. Detectives followed thousands of leads, interviewed countless witnesses, and looked closely at hundreds of possible suspects, yet every promising clue seemed to lead nowhere. For months, the case remained a mystery until an unexpected breakthrough finally uncovered the disturbing truth. Ardeth Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John's, Canada. A few years later, she became the older sister to two boys, and eventually the family settled in Ottawa. Ardeth attended Catholic schools while growing up, and later enrolled at university, where she focused her studies on history and philosophy. After completing her undergraduate education, she continued pursuing her academic goals and moved near Toronto to begin work on a PhD in philosophy. She was deeply committed to her studies and hoped to one day become a professor at a respected university. Her instructors often praised her intelligence and maturity, sometimes feeling as though they were speaking with a fellow academic rather than a student. Outside of school, Ardeth lived an active lifestyle. She enjoyed running, swimming, and cycling, and she also dreamed of starting a large family of her own one day. At the time, she was in a serious relationship and planned to marry her boyfriend after completing her doctoral studies. In the summer of 2003, at 27 years old, Ardeth returned to Ottawa to spend 2 weeks with her family. Since her university was nearly 300 miles away, opportunities to visit home were limited, and being away from her close-knit family had always been difficult for her. She wanted to make the most of every moment during her visit. On the morning of August 6th, she started the day with a run before returning home and making a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later, she and her mother planned to go shopping together, but weather reports warned that heavy rain was approaching. Wanting to get outside before the storm arrived, Ardeth decided to go for a bike ride. She borrowed her brother's bicycle, told her mother she would be back in about 90 minutes, and headed out. As the afternoon went on, dark clouds rolled in and the forecasted rain finally arrived. But Ardeth still had not come home. At first, her mother assumed she had simply taken shelter somewhere and was waiting for the weather to improve. But when the rain stopped and there was still no sign of her, concern quickly turned into fear. Her mother called her husband, who immediately gathered their sons and began searching for Ardeth. They drove along Ottawa's extensive network of bike paths, particularly the popular trail system where Ardeth and her brothers had spent countless hours cycling when they were younger. The problem was that nobody knew exactly where she had gone. She hadn't told anyone which route she planned to take before leaving. Despite searching for hours, her father and brothers found nothing. As evening approached and daylight began to fade, panic set in. More than 6 hours had passed since Ardeth had left the house, and her family became convinced that something was seriously wrong. They contacted police, but because Ardeth was an adult, authorities did not immediately launch a large-scale search operation. Refusing to sit back and wait, her family began contacting friends, neighbors, and anyone willing to help. Soon, dozens of volunteers were searching trails and parks throughout the city late into the night. Yet there was still no trace of her. One of the biggest challenges was Ottawa's massive trail network, which stretched for well over 100 miles. Without knowing which route Ardeth had chosen, searchers had little choice but to focus on the paths closest to her family home. The following morning, police officially joined the effort and established a command center near the Aviation Museum, where several major cycling routes connected. Officers were deployed across the city, and investigators appealed to the public for assistance. Photos of Ardeth were distributed to local newspapers and television stations, while residents were encouraged to join the search. The response was immediate. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers were helping look for her. Mounted police units were brought in, helicopters searched from above, and even military personnel assisted with the operation. Before long, the search for Ardith became one of the largest missing person investigations Ottawa had ever seen. Despite the enormous effort, however, no evidence of her whereabouts was found. As media coverage intensified, the case spread rapidly throughout the city and beyond. Police received hundreds of calls from people claiming to have seen something suspicious. During those first few days, several women contacted investigators with stories that immediately caught their attention. Each woman described being approached by a man under unusual circumstances, and according to their accounts, the descriptions all seemed to point to the very same individual. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and at first he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and sped away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect, but they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, and without solid evidence to connect him to Ardith's disappearance, putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So, they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases, even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Ardith's photo on the news and immediately recognized her because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. She rode past Ardith, but just a few seconds later, heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Ardith standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Ardith beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious, but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across 2 bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Ardith or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Ardith that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Ardith had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. 4 days after Ardith went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Ardith's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Ardith near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned. It was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Ardith's bike had turned up. And the very next day, The dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it. But they knew almost instantly it had to be Ardette. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene, but there was nothing. No footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Ardette. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Ardette had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Ardette's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Ardette's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible. The same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but once again, they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. But when they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardette disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder before Ardette's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves because it was their strongest lead. But as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one, but once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips, more than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardette's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardette was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So, they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up. But detectives kept going through the old ones one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call from an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed, claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardeth Wood case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and among them was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Ardeth's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardeth was believed to have been attacked around 1:30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardeth's murder and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos. Something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the 3rd time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was, they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardeth, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it. But when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardeth and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardeth supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed another girl appeared spooking Ardeth and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, But at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardeth on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardeth with a man before they vanished into the woods. It turned out Christopher had taken details from the news and reshaped them into a story that made it sound like he had been there. But not long after, he changed his version once again. This time, he claimed none of it was true. He insisted he had never even been inside the park and said everything he told detectives was simply made up using information he had seen in news reports. Investigators then asked him to take a polygraph test, and he failed it. Even after that, Christopher continued claiming he had nothing to do with Ardeth's murder. Without solid forensic evidence connecting him to the crime, detectives still couldn't charge him. While Christopher remained locked up in a neighboring city on unrelated charges, investigators turned their attention to his background, hoping something from his past would strengthen their case. They discovered that his biological mother had abused drugs and alcohol during pregnancy, leaving him with serious developmental and mental health problems from an early age. His childhood only became more troubled after that. He was physically abused until the age of 4, when he was adopted by another family, but even they eventually reached a breaking point. By the time Christopher was 12 years old, his behavior had become so disturbing that they could no longer care for him. He regularly talked to himself, wandered around in public without clothes, and became increasingly aggressive toward those around him. One psychologist who evaluated him later admitted Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever treated. As an adult, however, his life appeared much more ordinary from the outside. He managed to keep a steady job, rented his own place, and aside from a few minor arrests, stayed mostly out of trouble with police. He also had several girlfriends over the years, and detectives began tracking them down to learn more about him. One former girlfriend described Christopher as someone who could become violently angry without warning, and admitted he had assaulted her on several occasions. She also confirmed that he spent a huge amount of time riding his bicycle through local parks. Then, she revealed something detectives had been desperate to hear. Christopher often gave himself temporary tattoos, and more than once she had seen an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. That single detail changed everything. Until then, investigators had worried the eyewitness descriptions might not match the real offender. If Christopher had never worn an eagle tattoo, one of the strongest witness accounts would have completely fallen apart. But with someone close to him confirming that the tattoo did exist, detectives became convinced they finally had the right suspect. Even so, that evidence alone still wasn't enough to bring a murder case before a jury. What they really needed was Christopher to confess. 5 months after his arrest in the attempted assault case, detectives brought him back in for another interview. This time, they brought in an experienced investigator from the United Kingdom, someone known for persuading reluctant suspects to talk. At first, Christopher denied everything once again. But after hours of questioning, he returned to the same strange story he had told before. He claimed he met Ardeth near the river, kissed her, and that she accidentally drowned after becoming frightened by another girl nearby. Then, almost immediately, he took the entire story back and insisted none of it had happened. Not long afterward, though, he surprised detectives by drawing a map showing where he claimed he first met Ardeth and where the two of them supposedly walked together. He even agreed to take investigators to those locations. But as soon as they arrived at the park, Christopher suddenly changed his story again, claiming he didn't recognize the area at all. Although it wasn't a full confession, his contradictory statements were enough to keep investigators focused on him. At the same time, detectives were developing another theory. They believed Christopher might not only be responsible for Ardeth's murder, but also for several unsolved sexual assaults that had taken place across Ottawa during the same period. The attacks followed a similar pattern every time. A man would approach women in public, start a casual conversation, and then suddenly assault them. Investigators showed Christopher's photograph to several victims, and multiple women immediately identified him as the attacker without hesitation. Armed with those identifications, detectives questioned Christopher once again. After hours of interrogation, he finally admitted responsibility for 5 separate sexual assaults. Those confessions gave police the additional charges they needed and significantly strengthened the overall case against him in Ardeth's murder. Eventually, Christopher was formally charged with murder, and the case finally moved toward trial. After years of legal proceedings, prosecutors offered him a plea agreement in January 2008. If he pleaded guilty, the charge would be reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. Christopher accepted the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardeth while she was riding her bicycle, forced her into a wooded area intending to sexually assault her, and ultimately drowned her in the river. He also pleaded guilty to several of the other attacks against women. He received a life sentence, although the agreement allowed him to apply for parole after serving 10 years. That did not guarantee his release. When Christopher became eligible for parole in 2015, the board rejected his request. He applied again in 2020, but once more he was denied. Experts concluded that despite spending 15 years behind bars, he still posed a high risk of committing violent crimes if released. Christopher remains in prison today, and the chances of him ever being granted parole appear extremely small. Ardeth Wood's murder remains one of Ottawa's most well-known criminal cases and left a lasting impact on the community. For years afterward, many women were afraid to ride bicycles or even walk alone through local parks. Residents responded by organizing volunteer patrols, with groups cycling together along the city's trails to improve safety and reassure the public. Investigators have also said they believe Christopher committed more assaults than the ones he admitted to. Unfortunately, many victims never got a clear look at their attacker's face, making it impossible to connect every unsolved case to him with certainty. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe. Let's move on to the next case. A woman was discovered dead inside her luxury home, and in the beginning, everyone believed it was nothing more than a tragic accident. But as the days went by, details started to emerge that didn't quite fit the official story. The more people looked at the circumstances, the more questions they had. Eventually, investigators decided to take a second, much closer look. What they uncovered transformed a seemingly straightforward case into a national sensation, capturing the attention of millions across the country. Yet even after years of scrutiny and countless revelations, certain aspects of the mystery continue to trouble people to this day. Leslie London was born on April 26, 1951, in New York. She was raised in a large family in a peaceful neighborhood on Long Island. From a young age, she was driven by a desire to care for others, which led her to pursue a career in nursing after graduating from high school. Later in life, she met Robert Newlander, and at the age of 33, she became his wife. Robert already had 2 children from a previous marriage, and together they welcomed a son and a daughter. The family eventually made their home in Fayetteville, a small town near Syracuse, New York, where Robert worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist. His professional success grew steadily, and before long he opened his own medical practice. Leslie continued working as a nurse for several years, but after the birth of their second child, she chose to dedicate herself to raising their family. Throughout the years, both Leslie and Robert became known for their commitment to helping others. They supported local charitable causes, and Leslie even traveled out of state to volunteer in the aftermath of a devastating hurricane. Robert, meanwhile, delivered thousands of babies during his career and was credited with helping bring nearly half of the town's children into the world. As a result, the family earned a great deal of admiration and respect within the community. By September 2012, Leslie was 61 years old and living what appeared to be a comfortable and stable life. Most of her children had already moved away, except for her and Robert's 23-year-old daughter, Jenna, who still lived at home. On the morning of September 17, Robert returned from his regular run, prepared coffee for himself and Leslie, and carried a cup into their bedroom while she was showering. Afterward, he went to wake Jenna because the family planned to attend a church service scheduled for 9 a.m. However, around 8:20, Robert returned to the bedroom and noticed the shower was still running. Realizing Leslie hadn't come out, he walked in and found her lying on the floor, surrounded by blood. He immediately tried to call 911 using the bathroom phone, but the line was dead. He then yelled for Jenna and instructed her to call for emergency help. From her room, Jenna contacted 911 and initially told the dispatcher that her mother had fallen in the shower. Because she was using a corded landline, she couldn't immediately see what was happening. After giving their address, she set the phone down and went to check. Moments later, the dispatcher heard her scream that there was blood everywhere. At the same time, Robert dragged Leslie out of the bathroom and into the bedroom before attempting CPR, but his efforts were unsuccessful. When emergency responders arrived, Leslie had no pulse, and they were forced to declare her dead at the scene. Detectives later interviewed both Robert and Jenna before sending Leslie's body for examination. During the investigation, they learned she suffered from vertigo, a condition that causes sudden episodes of dizziness and loss of balance, and relatives explained that the issue had worsened over the years and appeared to run in the family. Not long afterward, the medical examiner concluded that Leslie had died after suffering a fatal head injury during a fall, leading authorities to classify the death as an accident. Friends and relatives were informed that she had simply slipped while showering, but not everyone accepted that explanation. One of Leslie's closest friends, Terry, who had previously worked as a nurse in Robert's medical practice, immediately felt that something wasn't right. She was among the first people to arrive at the house after the incident, and Jenna asked her to assist the housekeeper with cleaning because she couldn't bear the sight of her mother's blood. Jenna also asked her to make sure there were no bloodstains left in the bedroom, which struck Terry as odd. Why would there be blood in the bedroom if Leslie fell in the shower? When she stepped into the bedroom, Terry was even more surprised. There were large pools of blood on the floor and spatter on the walls and furniture, and there was so much of it that she and the housekeeper couldn't get it all out, especially from the carpet. The whole scene made her wonder if her friend had been killed, though she didn't want to believe it. She stayed with the family for the next week, turning it over in her mind. And she remembered that just days before her death, Leslie had called to say she and Robert were planning to divorce and wanted to talk in person. Only they never got the chance. Terry didn't want to start calling it a murder on nothing more than a gut feeling. So, she kept quiet for about a month until she remembered that a few months before the incident, she, Leslie, and a few friends had met for their book club at a friend's house, and the book that night was about a man who killed his wife. After they'd all finished it, one of the women said they could ask her anything about the topic because she'd been the county's chief medical examiner. That woman, Mary, had been retired for a few years, but Terry reached out anyway. After hearing her out, Mary said the murder angle sounded unlikely. Still, she advised Terry to call the police and share her concerns just in case. In the end, Terry did. Beyond the blood in the bedroom, she flagged something else. Robert had dragged Leslie from the shower into the bedroom. Even though an experienced doctor should know, you never move someone with a head injury. Detectives listened to her with more interest than she'd expected. But there was something Terry didn't know. The local police already had doubts of their own because an anonymous letter had landed at the Dawes office claiming Robert wasn't the upstanding man everyone thought, and that Leslie had been trying to leave him. Terry's mention that Leslie had planned to divorce Robert lined up with that letter, though they still couldn't trace the sender. Even so, there wasn't much they could do yet because the medical examiner's report still listed Leslie's death as an accident. Months went by like that until Mary decided to take a closer look, pushed into action by a call from Robert, his first since Leslie's death. He didn't say anything of substance, just apologized for the silence. But it brought Terry's doubts right back to mind. She contacted the district attorney and asked to see the file. Because she'd spent more than 20 years as a medical examiner, he agreed. On one condition, she wouldn't just glance at it. She'd produce a formal report with her findings as a professional. The moment Mary started going through the documents and photos, she was stunned. Yes, Leslie had a closed head injury you might see with a fall, but that was only a sliver of the picture. There were 5 separate scalp lacerations, facial wounds, and a bruise around one eye. Mary said she'd seen that combination in only 3 situations: car crashes, falls from 20 stories up, or serious beatings. Not a slip in the shower. Far more likely, in her view, Leslie had been struck 1 or more times with a heavy object. Something else also jumped out. There was clear blood spatter on the walls, the side of the bed, the nightstand, even on the water bottles sitting there. But the shower where Leslie supposedly fell was a good distance from the bed. In the end, Mary reached a conclusion she had no doubt about. Leslie had been murdered. She took it to the district attorney, who brought in additional medical experts, and they came to the same finding. As a result, the DA opened a formal investigation and detectives got to work. As soon as word spread that Robert was under suspicion, his children and Leslie's relatives rallied to his side, insisting he would never hurt his wife. And Robert hired one of the county's top defense attorneys, who likewise declared him innocent. The problem for investigators was simple. They didn't have a single piece of hard evidence tying him to a crime. But the deeper they dug, the more red flags they found. Police confirmed Leslie had been planning to divorce Robert. She was getting ready to move into a rental and was scheduled to sign the lease the very day she died. They also learned that shortly before her death, she'd met a man named Nevin. When detectives contacted him, he said they were just friends. He was about 30 years old, and they'd been messaging for a few weeks. At some point, Robert found out about it and was furious, even though the marriage was already ending. Nevin said Robert called him and demanded he stop talking to Leslie, and he also confronted Leslie about it. Some of Leslie's friends told detectives that Robert had cheated on her more than once, and Leslie knew it. On top of that, detectives learned Robert had been in serious financial trouble for years. It started when an insurance company accused him of pushing unnecessary services at his private clinic and decided he'd been overpaid by more than $1 million. He flatly denied it, and they went to court. But the insurer stopped working with him, which meant about half of his patients had to go elsewhere because their plans no longer covered the bills. He later shut down the clinic and took a hospital job that paid far less. And shortly before Leslie died, he lost that job, too. Colleagues told police he had changed over the past few years. He'd become short-tempered and kept clashing with people, and some staff eventually refused to work with him. With all that in hand, detectives decided to look in the house one more time. It was April by then, 7 months after Leslie's death. Robert had already sold the place, but the new owners hadn't moved in yet, and they allowed a walkthrough without a warrant. To the forensic team's surprise, there were still visible blood traces in the bathroom and the bedroom. They also spotted dried spatter on the curtains beside the bed and on the headboard. Detectives said they hadn't seen any blood on the headboard the day Leslie died because pillows were propped there. And now they couldn't explain how her blood ended up on that spot. By Robert and Jenna's account, he first pulled Leslie out of the shower into the bedroom, then dragged her again and positioned her between the bed and the window, explaining that the bathroom was too dark and too cramped for him to start CPR. On the 911 call, you can hear Jenna yelling at her dad to stop moving Leslie because even she knew that with a head or neck injury, you keep a person still. But even acknowledging the fact that he dragged her toward the bed, the blood on the headboard made no sense. It suggested that at some point Leslie was actually on the bed, yet there wasn't a single drop on the sheets. Detectives brought Robert back in for questioning, and he showed up with his attorneys, insisting that everything had happened exactly as he'd said and that he'd never hurt his wife. As for the blood spatter in the bedroom, Robert's attorneys had explanations. First, they said when Robert stepped into the shower and found Leslie on the floor, he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. After he dragged her into the bedroom, the sleeves got bloody, and he pulled the shirt off so it wouldn't get in the way while he tried to help her, which they argued could account for some of the splatter. Second, they said the EMTs could have caused it. They worked on Leslie for several minutes, so their gloves would have been covered in blood, and if they peeled them off carelessly, droplets could have flicked around the room. But detectives weren't convinced by those explanations. For starters, there was blood splatter all over the bedroom, yet none on the bed. It looked like someone had changed the sheets. And if Robert's story were true, pulling that off without Jenna, the paramedics or the police noticing would have been almost impossible. Robert denied changing anything, but the housekeeper told officers the sheets on the bed the day Leslie died weren't the ones she'd put on the day before. The prosecutor laid out a version that tied the loose ends together. He argued Robert killed his wife hours before the supposed fall in the shower, that he attacked her in the bedroom, possibly on the bed, and struck her in the head multiple times. After that, either Leslie tried to get away and ran to the shower, or Robert dragged her there and slammed her head against the stone ledge to stage an accident. Then, the theory goes, he turned on the water and left her under the shower for hours. He went for a run, but in reality drove to a nearby lake to dump the weapon and possibly the bedding and his bloody clothes. When he got back, he woke Jenna so that minutes later she'd call 911 and be a witness to her mother being found in the shower. After that, Robert went into the bathroom, lifted Leslie, and dragged her into the bedroom to give himself a reason for the blood on the floor and walls, which would also explain why a doctor with more than 30 years of experience made the basic mistake of moving someone with a head injury. He likely meant to call Jenna only after that, so she'd first see her mother in the shower. But he didn't account for one thing. Jenna saw the blood in the bedroom before he ever pulled Leslie from the bathroom. As we know from the 911 call, she yelled, "There's blood everywhere." And at that point, she still hadn't seen her mother. Which means the blood was already in the bedroom while Leslie was still in the shower. Something that doesn't fit the false story at all. Over the next few months, detectives kept looking for more evidence, but came up empty. There was one key development, though. They brought in a bloodstain pattern analyst who said the spatter in Leslie's bedroom pointed to blows to the head, not some other scenario like falling in the shower. About a year later, in June 2014, prosecutors finally charged Robert with second-degree murder. He was arrested and released on $100,000 bail. The trial began almost a year after that. Robert and Leslie's children stood by him, as did some of her relatives. His defense stuck to the same story, a fall in the shower, and said he dragged her into the bedroom only because it was too cramped and dark to start life-saving measures in there. They also called their own expert, who testified that the available information just wasn't enough to prove a homicide. A personal trainer and Leslie's relatives told the jury she had vertigo and that it had gotten worse in recent months. The prosecution leaned on the medical findings that undercut the fall theory and pointed instead to blows from a heavy object. They noted that every injury was centered on the head. With a slip in the shower, you'd expect an elbow, a knee, or something else to be banged up too. And then there were the bruises on her face on the opposite side from the spot she supposedly hit, raising the obvious question of where those came from. Jenna took the stand, and her testimony split the room. First, she contradicted the housekeeper and said the bedding was the same set as the day before. When the prosecutor asked if she'd seen blood in the bedroom before Robert pulled Leslie from the shower, she said no, even though her initial statements and the 911 call suggested otherwise. She also said she tried to help her father with CPR, something she hadn't mentioned before. And when you add that to the other steps she claimed she'd taken during the brief gap in the 911 call, it should have taken at least 50 seconds. Yet she was off the line for only 13. Police tried to recreate everything she described and couldn't do it in less than 50 seconds. On top of that, Jenna testified she saw her father pull off a bloody shirt and toss it aside. But by the time police and EMTs arrived, that shirt was gone. And in the months that followed, Robert never produced it. Prosecutors said Jenna was so unwilling to accept that her father might be guilty that she talked herself into seeing the facts as proof he wasn't. Even so, the jury found Robert guilty. And in July 2015, he was sentenced to 20 years to life. Leslie's sister said she still didn't believe Robert did it and was disappointed by the verdict. Robert's children immediately hired a new attorney known for defending mob boss John Gotti, and he began filing appeals. He soon discovered that one juror had flagrantly violated the rules by discussing the case with relatives and friends. Her own father even texted, "Make sure he's guilty." In all, about 7,000 messages were uncovered, and the defense moved for a new trial. The judge denied it at first, but 3 years later in 2018, Robert's team got the conviction thrown out. A new trial was set, and for the next 2 years, he remained free on $1 million bail. The new trial opened in the spring of 2022, and Robert's attorneys were aiming for an acquit. What they didn't know was that the prosecution had 2 new pieces of evidence that leaned hard towards homicide. First, they sent the bed's headboard to a lab. 10 years after the killing, technicians found a tiny fragment of fatty tissue from the victim's scalp embedded in it. If Leslie had truly slipped and fallen in the shower, there's no reasonable explanation for how that material ended up on the headboard. But if she was attacked while sitting or lying on the bed, the evidence suddenly makes a lot more sense. The second clue had been sitting in plain view from the very beginning. According to Robert's account, he woke up that morning, went for his usual run by the lake, returned home, made coffee for both himself and Leslie, placed her mug on the nightstand while she was showering, and then roughly 30 minutes later, discovered her injured in the bathroom. But when investigators took another close look at the crime scene photographs, they noticed something odd. The coffee mug was completely clean. Not a single drop of blood appeared on it, despite the fact that the nightstand itself and the water bottles sitting beside it were covered with blood spatter. Based on the direction and distribution of the droplets, the mug should have been hit as well. The fact that it wasn't suggested only one possibility: the mug wasn't on the nightstand when the blood landed there. That observation fit perfectly with the prosecution's theory. They argued that Robert killed Leslie before ever leaving the house that morning. Later, after blood had already been deposited around the bedroom and Leslie's body had been moved into the shower, he returned with the coffee mug and staged the scene. Prosecutors believed he carefully arranged events so Jenna would witness what appeared to be a husband discovering his wife after a tragic accident. There was also another major difference from the first trial. This time, prosecutors presented a clearer motive. Previously, they had struggled to explain why Robert would have wanted Leslie dead. During the second trial, they argued he had recently learned Leslie was preparing to move into a rental property and that she had been communicating with another man. Feelings of jealousy, anger, and a desire to maintain control may have triggered a violent confrontation. Alternatively, they suggested money played a significant role. By that point, Robert's fortunes had changed dramatically. He had lost his clinic, left his position, and gone from being a successful physician to someone without steady employment. Under New York's divorce laws, Leslie could have been entitled to a substantial portion of their shared assets, including roughly half the value of their home. A divorce might have forced Robert to sell the property and surrender a significant amount of money, something prosecutors argued he may have been unwilling to accept. Armed with the new evidence and a stronger theory of motive, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching a verdict. They found Robert guilty. Then, on May 2nd, 2022, he was sentenced once again to 20 years to life in prison. Despite the conviction, many members of Robert's family, including his children, continued to insist he was innocent and asked the judge to show mercy. During his final statement, Robert pleaded for the opportunity to spend the remainder of his life near his loved ones, rather than dying behind bars. The court was unmoved, and the sentence remained in place. His legal team later attempted to overturn the conviction, but in 2024 his appeal was rejected, leaving him with almost no remaining options to challenge the verdict or obtain an early release. In many ways, the long and complicated case had finally reached its conclusion. Yet, even after two separate convictions, not everyone is convinced justice was served. Beyond Robert's children and several of Leslie's relatives, many people who followed the case still believe her death may have been the result of a tragic accident rather than murder. And there's one final mystery that remains unsolved. Just days after Leslie's death, investigators received an anonymous letter questioning Robert's character and raising suspicions that helped shift attention away from the accident theory. Detectives spent years trying to identify the person behind that letter, but despite repeated efforts, they never succeeded. To this day, the author's identity remains unknown. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Thanks for watching. Let's move on to the next case. This astonishing case left seasoned detectives and even FBI agents completely baffled because nothing about it resembled anything they had encountered before. The circumstances were so bizarre that, had they appeared in a Hollywood thriller, most people would have dismissed them as unrealistic. Yet every part of it unfolded in real life, earning its place among the most extraordinary cases ever documented. Mindy Meben was born in South Carolina in 1982 and grew up in a close-knit family with two younger brothers. From an early age, she was known for her generosity, warmth, and willingness to help anyone who needed it. Friends remembered her as someone who could always be counted on. She had a passion for creativity, which led her to attend college in Georgia, where she earned a degree in the arts. Not content to stop there, she later moved to Virginia and completed a master's degree in international relations. Over the following years, Mindy built a successful career, working for several law firms before transitioning into the nonprofit sector, where she felt she could make a greater difference in people's lives. She also started a small business on the side that provided extra income. In 2014, she met Nick, and the two quickly formed a relationship. Nick had an impressive career of his own, serving as a Navy judge advocate, later becoming a military prosecutor, and eventually working at the Pentagon as legal counsel for senior Navy officials. They married in 2016 and settled in a quiet community near Washington, D.C. A few years later, Nick left government service to work on a highly classified software project for Microsoft, while Mindy continued her nonprofit work and managed her business. Their lives seemed stable, and they had begun discussing plans for children. Then, everything changed without warning. One day, Nick was contacted by a man claiming to be an FBI agent who told him he was in serious danger because of both his previous government work and the secret Microsoft project. According to the agent, powerful individuals were targeting him, and his family could become collateral damage. He refused to provide specifics, but insisted Nick follow every instruction if he wanted to stay alive. Soon afterward, Nick and Mindy were moved into temporary rental properties and told they could not remain in any one location for long. The agent personally selected the homes, arranged the bookings under different identities, and claimed federal agents were monitoring the properties around the clock. He instructed them to remain indoors whenever possible and avoid going outside without approval. Their normal methods of communication were abandoned in favor of an encrypted messaging platform where conversations disappeared immediately after being read. Contact with friends was prohibited entirely, and even interactions with close family members came with strict limitations. As the restrictions intensified, Mindy found it impossible to continue working and eventually resigned from her job. Financial pressures quickly followed. Nick possessed substantial assets, including stock options reportedly worth more than $30 million. But the agent warned that hostile actors were attempting to access his accounts. To protect the funds, he claimed they needed to be transferred into a trust. By late 2021, mounting financial strain forced the couple to move into the South Carolina home of Mindy's younger brother and his wife. Because her brother worked as a police officer, the arrangement provided at least some sense of security. Mindy's parents moved in as well, and for months the family lived together, while Nick devoted nearly all of his time to the classified Microsoft project he believed would eventually provide financial relief. When Mindy's brother later decided to sell the property, everyone had to relocate once again. Her mother arranged a hotel stay in Savannah, Georgia, where they remained for several weeks before the supposed FBI agent directed them to another rental house. Mindy's parents joined them there, and the unusual rules only became more restrictive. Nick and Mindy could not leave the property without permission. Her parents often had to request approval before returning home and sometimes found themselves waiting for hours. Mindy's father, despite not having a job, was frequently instructed to leave the house for portions of the day because the agent claimed they might be under surveillance. The family existed in a constant state of anxiety and uncertainty. Then, amid all the fear and disruption, a rare piece of good news arrived when Mindy shared with her parents that she was pregnant. It was the best kind of news and the scariest at the same time. They were thrilled for a grandchild, but worried about raising a baby while Nick and his family were being hunted. All they could do was hope the FBI would sort this out so they could finally stop hiding. By late 2022, Mindy was 8 months pregnant and due in early January, but the pressure on the family kept climbing. Nick now had to hide from his own parents. Through the FBI agent, he was told that he'd actually been kidnapped as a child and later adopted. His biological parents were diplomats, so he cut off contact with his adoptive family. Soon, his adoptive father hired a private investigator, found their address, and showed up with his brother. They tried to force their way in before finally leaving, and no one knew what they were after, which gave Nick and Mindy one more thing to worry about. On top of that, Mindy's health started to slide. Her blood pressure was all over the place, and for almost a month, she barely got out of bed. Her parents cared for her around the clock. But at the end of November, they decided to visit their son for a few days. On November 23rd, Thanksgiving, they left while Mindy still felt awful. And after they left, she got worse. So, she and Nick decided she needed to go to the hospital. Nick called her parents and said she'd been admitted to a small private clinic where doctors would keep an eye on her and handle the delivery, which was a little more than a month away. Her parents came back soon after, and Mindy was supposed to be discharged in a few days. She was texting Nick that she felt better, so the doctors decided to let her go home for a couple of weeks. On December 1st, Nick drove to the clinic to pick up his wife, only to be told they'd had to move Mindy to a military hospital because her condition had suddenly gotten worse. The hospital was on a military base, and Nick went there right away. He said he wanted to see his wife, but the doctors told him she was gone. They said she went into cardiac arrest brought on by dangerously high blood pressure, and doctors couldn't bring her back. Their baby didn't survive either. Mindy's family was in shock. They'd seen how much her health had crashed over the past month, but they still couldn't take in that their daughter was dead, and they couldn't even see her body because they didn't have clearance to enter the base. A little later, Nick went to collect her remains for a funeral, but the hospital told him she'd already been cremated without the family's consent. They said her ashes were in neighboring Alabama and gave him an address where he could pick them up. He drove out there, where a man met him by the roadside and handed over an urn with Minnie's ashes. No paperwork, nothing. Even so, Nick started planning a memorial. In the meantime, he rented an apartment for Minnie's parents because it was unbearable for them to stay in the house where they'd all lived in those last months. He kept in regular contact until late February 2023, when he suddenly vanished. A few days later, Mindy's parents got a letter from the FBI agents saying Nick had been in a serious car crash and was in a hospital in critical condition. He wouldn't say which hospital, because he said Nick was still in danger, and the fewer people who knew where he was, the better. Months later, another letter arrived saying Nick had died. Everything about it felt wrong, and Mindy's parents started to wonder if both Nick and Mindy had been killed. Maybe by the same people who'd been hunting him for years. But there was nothing they could do, and they were left to live with it, not knowing this was only the beginning. In May 2023, about 6 months after everything that had happened, Mindy's mother got a call from police with a story that shook her to the core. It started on December 2nd, 2022, the day after Nick went to pick up Mindy and was told she'd been moved to a military hospital. A hunter in Georgia headed into the woods outside Savannah. As he walked past the shallow ditch, he noticed something strange and moved closer. To his horror, he realized it was a woman's torso missing the head and legs. He called police right away, and before long, investigators and agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were on scene. While the medical team worked to remove the torso, officers began sweeping the area for more evidence. Soon, they got another call. A second hunter a few hundred yards away had found a plastic storage container, and next to it, a knife with the handle wrapped in a disinfecting wipe. Detectives figured those items were probably tied to the torso and kept searching the woods. The next day, the same hunter went to a different spot about 2 miles away. As soon as he pushed deeper into the trees, he came across a human leg. That same day, canine units were deployed, and the dogs led officers to a second leg and a container stained with what looked like blood. Then to a buried cache of women's clothing soaked in blood and cut into small pieces with disinfectant wipes scattered nearby, and a lot of empty trash bags. When the medical examiners reviewed the remains, they put the time of death between November 27th and November 30th, just days before the discovery. And while they couldn't name a single definitive cause, it was clearly a homicide. There were multiple stab wounds, along with classic defense injuries, and the body had been dismembered using a saw and a knife. A few days later, search teams with dogs found the victim's head buried a good distance from everything else, and there was an obvious mark from a heavy blow. Even so, police still couldn't identify her, There were no fingerprints in any database, no DNA to match against, and checks on recent women in the county turned up nothing. The head was badly decomposed, which meant they couldn't say with certainty what the victim looked like. So, detectives turned to a specialist, a forensic artist known for reconstructing faces from skulls. About 2 weeks after the remains were found, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation released a composite of the victim along with a basic description. They were hoping someone would recognize her, but nothing useful came in. That went on for a while, until investigators put out an updated, sharper sketch and added a more precise timeline. Experts now believed she'd been killed on November 27th. And the new sketch finally broke the case open. A woman named Heather called and said the face looked a lot like the wife of her ex-husband, a man named Nick Cassidus. She told them she'd seen Nick with Mindy a few years back, and the sketch was a strong match. Detectives took the lead seriously, but they couldn't find any recent trace of Mindy or Nick. So, they turned to genetic genealogy and sent the DNA to a lab. Over the next few months, specialists built out a family tree that led straight to the victim's relatives, which is why in the end, they reached out to Mindy's mother. She was stunned by what she was hearing, but agreed to provide a DNA sample, and the test confirmed the victim was her daughter. It was Mindy. The family was in disbelief and walked investigators through the story they'd been living for years. How unknown people were supposedly hunting Nick. How the threat put everyone around him at risk. How Mindy had died of cardiac arrest during late pregnancy. And how Nick had then been in a horrific car crash that they were told killed him too. Detectives found the whole thing hard to swallow because there were no official records of either Mindy or Nick being dead. And if both had really been in hospitals, that absence of paperwork was almost impossible. So they started tracing Nick's last known steps and ran the plates on the car he bought shortly before everything went down, which turned up at a junkyard almost completely burned out. A detail that on the surface fit the story about a serious car crash. Even so, they still couldn't find any proof that he was dead. Detectives also learned that shortly before everything went down, Nick and Mindy had changed their last name to Stark, his biological parents' real surname. That led police to a man named Nicholas Killian James Stark, who fit the age and was living in Pennsylvania, married to a woman named Samantha Kolonik, a fairly well-known true crime author. Investigators reached out and started asking questions about her husband. Looking at Nick's photo, she confirmed that yes, that was her husband, and he was pretty much alive. She said they'd met in September 2022, a few months before Minnie's death, after Nick messaged her on social media to praise her books, and the two of them started talking. He told her he liked writing true crime stories himself, and on top of that said his wife Mindy and their unborn child had died years earlier, even though at that point, Mindy was still alive. Samantha got interested in his short true crime pieces, which he was posting on a forum where he'd built a sizable audience. More than that, Sony had even bought the rights to one of his stories for $300,000. Nick also told Samantha he worked as a corporate lawyer and was constantly on the road from state to state. Soon after Mindy died, he came to Pennsylvania to see Samantha. They started dating, and in March 2023, they got married. They were planning to buy a house. But on the day Nick left the bank with an $800,000 check, his car suddenly caught fire and exploded, destroying everything he owned and the check along with it. But somehow, he walked away without a scratch, just badly shaken. Samantha had no idea that Nick's former wife died after she and Nick had already met. And even that wasn't the only thing she didn't know about him. After Nick's first wife called in and recognized Mindy from the sketch, detectives sat down with her. During their divorce, she said Nick had agreed to pay her $1.5 million for their house, but he hadn't paid a cent. and for years the authorities couldn't even find him. They also checked with Microsoft, who said Nick had never worked on any of their projects. And when the FBI got involved, they confirmed that none of their agents had spent years helping Nick hide from anyone. That was enough to make an arrest, and Nick was brought in for questioning. He seemed calm and repeated the same story he told Minnie's parents. He'd taken her to a private clinic. She'd suffered cardiac arrest from severe hypertension, and there was nothing anyone could do. Though for some reason he couldn't remember the clinic's name or where it was. He added that the message about his own death was only partly untrue. He claimed he'd really been in a serious crash, and that he and the FBI agent faked his death so the people hunting him wouldn't find him in the hospital. Whenever detectives pressed him on the gaps and contradictions, Nick said the agent had given him specific orders or told him not to share certain details. He also kept insisting he had nothing to do with Mindy's murder and would never hurt her, even after real FBI agents told him the Bureau had never contacted him and certainly hadn't helped him disappear. Nick stuck to his story. He also claimed Mindy had seen this agent herself, but she wasn't alive to confirm or deny it. Detectives no longer had any doubt Nick was behind Mindy's murder. But two big problems remained: almost no hard evidence and no clear motive. He'd spent years telling his wife and her family that people were hunting him, dragging them from place to place and basically locking them down. But why? Investigators had a few ideas about what might have happened, but theories alone weren't enough. They needed evidence, and before long, they started finding exactly that. Since experts determined Mindy died on November 27th, the same day her parents left to visit her brother, detectives became convinced the murder had taken place inside the house. They contacted the property's owner and asked whether anything unusual stood out after Nick moved away. She immediately recalled that someone had replaced the carpet with a nearly identical version, except it was noticeably cheaper, while the original carpet had completely disappeared. Crime scene specialists examined the property and, despite the amount of time that had passed, located 3 separate areas where blood had been cleaned. DNA testing later confirmed the blood belonged to Mindy. Detectives then turned their attention to Nick's digital trail. Phone records and location data showed that on November 29th, he traveled toward the same wooded area where Mindy's remains would eventually be discovered. Around that time, his phone suddenly stopped transmitting data. Surveillance footage from a camera near the entrance to the area captured a vehicle matching Nick's arriving just as the phone went offline. Investigators continued digging and uncovered another troubling pattern. 3 months before the murder, in August, Nick purchased rubber gloves along with the same type of disinfecting wipes later found near the remains. To detectives, it suggested planning rather than impulse. Then, in the weeks leading up to Mindy's disappearance, he bought several more items, including a knife matching the one recovered from the woods, as well as a saw, shovel, and hammer. By that point, prosecutors believed they had assembled a strong enough case to move forward. In August 2025, nearly 2 years after the crime, the trial finally began. Nick's defense attorney argued that his client was innocent and pointed the finger at the mysterious FBI agent. According to the defense, the man was real but not an actual federal agent and had manipulated Nick for reasons nobody fully understood. Prosecutors, however, presented a completely different narrative. They argued the entire story was fiction. The threats, the agent, the secret operations, the multi-million-dollar assets, even the Microsoft project, none of it was real. Instead, they said Nick had been unemployed and struggling under significant financial pressure, including debt related to his former marriage. In their view, the constant relocations, secrecy, and isolation were not safety measures at all, but an attempt to avoid creditors and stay beyond the reach of court orders. Jurors were shown records of Nick's purchases and movements, and Nick himself acknowledged traveling to the wooded area. He claimed he had simply transported Mindy's belongings there in a plastic container because the agent instructed him to do so. Taking the witness stand, Nick repeated the same account, insisting he never harmed his wife and that his actions were the result of following orders from the mysterious figure who had controlled so much of their lives. Nick's parents also testified. They rejected his claims that he had been kidnapped as a child and stated that they were, in fact, his biological parents. Despite that disagreement, they stood firmly behind him and said they did not believe he was capable of murdering Mindy, though they admitted they had been largely estranged from him for years. Then the trial took an unexpected turn. Throughout the investigation, everyone believed Mindy had been 8 months pregnant when she died, yet medical experts found no evidence whatsoever that she had ever been pregnant. The revelation shocked many people in the courtroom because it directly contradicted what she had told relatives and friends. Prosecutors suggested that Mindy may have pretended to be expecting a child at Nick's urging, possibly as part of the elaborate narrative surrounding the threats and the supposed FBI operation. One theory held that the fake pregnancy was meant to discourage anyone allegedly targeting Nick from harming her. Another possibility centered on Nick's first marriage. One of the reasons that relationship ended was because his first wife was unable to have children, while Nick strongly wanted a family. Prosecutors suggested Mindy may have fabricated the pregnancy to keep him from leaving, although they acknowledged that explanation had weaknesses. As for motive, one possibility was that Nick discovered she was not actually pregnant and reacted violently. But investigators noted he had begun purchasing suspicious items months before, and by then he had already become involved with another woman. Prosecutors argued the simpler explanation made far more sense. According to them, Nick wanted a new life with Samantha and decided Mindy stood in the way. Another detail that drew widespread attention involved Nick's writing. He had published short crime and horror stories online, and one of them, a story whose rights were later acquired by Sony, contained elements that many found eerily familiar. The plot centered on a mother-in-law named Betsy who secretly poisoned her son's wife, causing her health to steadily decline. The son in the story had also lost a previous wife under suspicious circumstances, and even his own mother suspected him of being responsible. In real life, Mindy had reportedly been feeling sick for weeks before her death, and with the pregnancy now ruled out, some people wondered whether there was another explanation. Although toxicology experts found no evidence of poison in her remains, speculation persisted that she may have been given something difficult to detect. Still, investigators never uncovered proof supporting that theory. When the case was finally handed to the jury, deliberations lasted just over an hour. The verdict was guilty. Nick was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 25 years. While the trial brought the case to a legal conclusion, many aspects of the story remain difficult to fully explain. Even now, it stands as one of the most unusual and unsettling cases in recent memory. Let's move on to the next case. A college freshman left her dorm to stop by a friend's party, but she never made it there. When she suddenly disappeared, investigators launched an urgent search and uncovered one unsettling clue after another. Yet every lead that seemed ready to crack the case eventually went nowhere. For more than a decade, the mystery remained unsolved until one unexpected discovery finally exposed what had really happened, catching everyone completely off guard. Stephanie Hummer was born on August 4, 1975, in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she was raised by devoted parents alongside her 2 younger brothers, whom she had helped care for from an early age. She excelled in school, earning top grades while staying active in nearly everything. Stephanie played both soccer and softball, performed the violin, and had a deep appreciation for classical music. Like her father, she also developed a passion for golf and spent several years working as a caddy at a local golf course. Her strong academic record, combined with her time as a caddy, earned her the highly respected Evans Scholarship, better known as the Chick Evans Caddy Scholarship, which covered the full cost of attending a top university. In 1993, at just 18 years old, Stephanie began studying landscape architecture at Ohio State University. She adjusted quickly to college life, made close friends, and continued earning outstanding grades. On March 5, 1994, near the end of her freshman year, her parents traveled to Columbus because her younger brother had qualified for the finals of a math competition being held there. Two of Stephanie's closest friends from Cincinnati also came to visit, and that evening they spent hours relaxing in her dorm room, laughing and catching up. Around midnight, two fellow students stopped by. They were also from Cincinnati and had attended the same high school as the girls. As the night went on, around 3 a.m., the two young men invited everyone to a party at their dorm, about a 15-minute walk across campus. The group set off together, but along the way one of the guys attempted to climb over a fence as a shortcut, and unable to see clearly in the darkness, sliced his arm badly on a sharp metal rod. He and his friend immediately rushed back to their dorm so he could get treated, leaving the girls behind. At that point, Stephanie's friends decided they were too tired to keep going since they planned to leave for home the next morning. Stephanie, however, still wanted to stop by the party for a little while. Since her friends were staying in her dorm, she insisted on walking them safely back, even though they told her they could find their way without any trouble. After making sure they got inside, she said goodbye, turned around, and headed toward the party alone. Her dorm was located right beside campus in an area students considered safe. People were constantly walking around at all hours, especially on weekends when parties were everywhere, so Stephanie had no reason to think she was in danger. She knew the route well and had walked those streets many times before. The possibility that something terrible could happen simply never crossed her mind. The next morning, when her friends woke up, Stephanie still hadn't returned. At first, they assumed she had stayed late at the party or spent the night in the other dorm. But as the hours passed without any sign of her, they became increasingly uneasy. Since they were supposed to leave that day, they expected Stephanie to come back to say goodbye. Yet she never appeared. By late morning, just before noon, they reported her disappearance to campus police. Officers contacted Stephanie's parents, who had already driven back home, to tell them their daughter was missing. Her father immediately reached out to the Columbus Police Department, which officially opened a missing person investigation. As detectives began piecing together her last known movements, they learned that earlier that same morning, another report had come in. Around 10 a.m., a railroad worker traveling slowly along tracks roughly 4 miles from campus noticed what looked like a mannequin lying in the brush. When he got closer, he realized with horror that it was actually the body of a young woman. He put it out over the radio and his co-workers called the police. When officers arrived, they found the victim almost completely undressed, only socks and shoes still on with her bra looped around her neck, and there were no personal items anywhere nearby, which meant they had no way to ID on the spot. The place where she was found had a lousy reputation, the kind of patch where dealers met buyers and suspicious activity turned up after dark. So, the first thought was that the victim might be tied to that world. But detectives backed off that idea pretty quickly. One of them suggested she could be an Ohio State student, so they reached out to campus police. Soon they learned Stephanie had been reported missing and got her father on the phone. He gave them a description, and detectives realized that the slain woman was most likely Stephanie. So her parents turned the car around, drove back to Columbus, and went to the morgue where they confirmed the body was their daughter. Medical examiners determined she died from a blow to the head with an unknown heavy object. She'd also been sexually assaulted, and they collected a semen sample for DNA testing. The bruising on her neck looked like strangulation at first, but on a closer look, it read more like hickeys. So, they swabbed her neck for additional biological material and sent those samples to the lab along with the semen. They also put the time of death somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. Detectives spoke with Stephanie's friends who walked them through what had happened that night, then went over to the dorm where the two guys who'd invited them to the party lived. Those guys said Stephanie never showed, and everyone else they interviewed backed it up. Investigators also asked whether either guy had been in an intimate relationship with Stephanie, since the marks on her neck didn't sit right, and suggested the killer might have been someone she'd been with. That things might have started consensually and then turned when she tried to stop it. But both of them insisted Stephanie was just a friend. Detectives also noticed the bandage on one of their arms and thought it was suspicious, but he explained he'd cut himself on a fence, and his friends confirmed it. And on top of that, both guys agreed to take polygraphs and provide DNA samples. So the cops crossed these guys off their list. But soon enough, the case took a sharp turn. The lab compared the guy's DNA to the swab taken from the victim's neck and got a full match. It belonged to Thomas, the same guy who'd sliced his arm on the fence the night before. Detectives brought him right back in and laid the evidence on the table. Earlier, he'd insisted there was nothing romantic between him and Stephanie, but now he said they'd been making out that night, which raised eyebrows, not just because he'd kept a pretty crucial detail to himself, but because everyone else who'd been in Stephanie's room swore they hadn't seen anything like that. Thomas said he'd just forgotten to mention it, claiming they'd kissed on the couch while the others were in the next room, and that it hadn't gone any further. But detectives weren't buying it. They considered the possibility that he might have run into Stephanie later when she was walking across campus by herself. But then came another twist. The lab finished processing the biological material collected from Stephanie's body, and it didn't match Thomas. It belonged to an unknown male who wasn't in the FBI's database, which is why detectives took Thomas off the suspect list, since the evidence pointed to someone else as the assailant. They also collected DNA from every student living in Thomas's dorm, but they didn't get a single match. Since his DNA didn't hit any database, detectives figured they might be dealing with someone on his first offense. And with what little they had, they started sketching out a timeline for that night. Because Stephanie's body was found about a 10-minute drive from her dorm, they believe the attacker struck her in the head with something heavy, loaded her into his car, and took her out to that quiet strip by the railroad tracks. In their view, he assaulted her inside the car while she was unconscious. But at some point, Stephanie came to, and she may even have managed to get out and run because the brush near where she was found was crushed down like someone had been fighting to push through it. She didn't get far though, and he chased Stephanie down before killing her. Over the next few days, police canvassed students and people who lived in the area, hoping for anything that might break the case open, but nothing stuck. That's how it went for almost a month, until detectives finally got their first real lead. Their colleagues had arrested a man named Michael for trying to abduct a student from the same university, and investigators immediately asked the lab to compare his DNA, but to their surprise, Michael had nothing to do with Stephanie's murder. Not long after, a man came forward about his friend, a guy named Anton. According to him, a few days after the killing, Anton had asked if he could keep a very big secret, then told him that he'd been near campus the night Stephanie was killed. After that, Anton straight up confessed that he was the one who had kidnapped and murdered her. Detectives wired the friend's phone and asked him to call Anton so they could get it on tape. And not only did Anton repeat the confession, he dropped a detail that made detectives sit up. He mentioned the glow from a large TV tower you could see from the spot where the body was found. Right after that, Anton was brought in for questioning, and suddenly he flipped the story, insisting he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed he'd heard about it on the news and was messing with his buddy. And as for the TV tower, he said he'd been out there before and just remembered the view. None of that did much to convince detectives he was innocent. But his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. So, despite all the red flags, they crossed him off the suspect list. Not long after, the FBI joined the case and the whole investigation kicked up a level. Detectives had already logged several reports from locals who on the night of the murder saw a white van cruising their streets, and that thread suddenly started to look a lot more promising. Working through ex-cons who lived near the crime scene, they landed on a man named Rodney who'd done time for kidnappings. Back when he was locked up, they weren't collecting inmate DNA yet, so he wasn't in the FBI database. He worked for a transport company with an office right by where Stephanie's body had been found, and the company used white vans, the same kind he could get his hands on. So, detectives went to talk to his co-workers. One of them told them something that made their skin crawl. Rodney had bragged about a game he liked to play where he'd drive a work van onto campus, walk up to female students, claim he was an undercover cop, and lure them into the van where he'd start putting his hands on them. They also spoke with Rodney's ex-girlfriend and learned she lived near Stephanie's dorm. But there's more. She'd said she'd broken up shortly before the murder, and he hadn't taken it well at all. He'd been acting scary and clearly unstable. That was enough for a warrant to search the van he'd been using, and inside they found handcuffs, a flashlight, and a handgun that turned out to be stolen. Rodney was arrested and brought in, but he refused to answer any questions. Even so, detectives took his DNA and sent it to the lab. But when the results came back, they could hardly believe it. Despite everything pointing his way, his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body, which meant they had to cross him off the list. And just like that, they were back to nothing. From that point on, the case barely budged. Detectives kept chasing tips, and Stephanie's parents went to the media again and again, pleading with the public to come forward with anything that might help catch their daughter's killer. Almost 2 years later, police landed on a new suspect. A man arrested in California for murder and sexual assault. When investigators dug in, they learned that at the time Stephanie was killed, he'd been living near her dorm. But the DNA ruled him out. There were also several men who tried to take credit for Stephanie's murder. Yet none of their DNA matched the attackers. They turned out to be inmates from the same prison, hoping to spin the case into a movie or a book deal. After that, nothing meaningful surfaced, and the investigation basically froze for years. That's how it stayed until 2005, when Ohio changed the law to collect DNA from all convicted felons. Before that, you could be stopped over and over, or even served time for lesser offenses, and your DNA still wouldn't be in the system. Once samples were taken at booking, the database was flooded with new profiles. On January 17, 2006, a call came in to Columbus PD. By then, the lead detective on Stephanie's case had retired, and a new investigator had taken over. On the phone, he was told there'd just been a hit in the FBI database. A profile had been added that matched the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. It belonged to a Columbus resident named Jonathan Gravely. The investigator immediately rang his predecessor, who still hoped the case would break, and shared the news. In 12 years of work, police had never crossed his name. When they dug in, they found Jonathan lived just a 12-minute walk from campus. At the time Stephanie was killed, Jonathan was 24 years old and already the father of 2 children. Over the next 12 years, life seemed to move on for him. He divorced, remarried, welcomed 2 more children, and secured a stable, well-paying job at a local manufacturing plant. As detectives dug deeper into his background, they discovered he had been arrested 17 times over the years, mostly for drug offenses, alcohol-related incidents, and driving under the influence. None of those earlier arrests, however, were serious enough under the law at the time to require a DNA sample, which meant his profile was never entered into the national database. That changed in 2006 when he was arrested once again. By then, new DNA collection laws had taken effect, and his sample was finally entered into the system. Almost immediately, it generated a match to the DNA recovered in Stephanie Hummer's murder investigation. Ironically, the arrest that ultimately connected him to a 12-year-old cold case stemmed from something far less serious. He had failed to make a child support payment, prompting his ex-wife to contact police. Just 2 days after the DNA match was confirmed, the detective newly assigned to the case, accompanied by the retired investigator who had spent years pursuing answers, went to Jonathan's workplace. The moment they told him they wanted to speak with him, they noticed he became visibly nervous, his hands trembling, though he agreed to accompany them to the station for questioning. Once detectives informed him that his DNA had been linked to Stephanie's murder, Jonathan denied any involvement. He claimed the two had met in a bar that night, struck up a conversation, and later drove somewhere private where they supposedly had consensual sex. Investigators immediately found the story implausible. Stephanie was only 18 years old, below the legal drinking age, and it made little sense that she would abandon friends she had just walked back to her dorm in order to spend the night with a stranger she had allegedly met in a bar. When detectives challenged his account, Jonathan changed his version of events. He now claimed the encounter began consensually and that Stephanie had initiated it, but later changed her mind and threatened to tell his wife. According to him, an argument followed. He struck her, and afterward he couldn't remember what happened. Detectives weren't convinced by that explanation either. Instead, they laid out the scenario they believed had actually occurred. As Stephanie walked alone toward her friend's dorm to attend the party, Jonathan, who owned a white van, spotted her on a quiet stretch of road. Investigators believe he approached her under the guise of asking for directions or some other innocent question before suddenly attacking her, striking her in the head and rendering her unconscious. They say he then forced her into his van and drove to the isolated location where her body would later be discovered. While she was unconscious, he sexually assaulted her. At some point, Stephanie regained consciousness and managed to escape from the vehicle. But Jonathan chased her down, forced her to the ground, and repeatedly beat her until she died. Although he continued denying that he had abducted her, he ultimately admitted responsibility for killing Stephanie, leading to his arrest and the long-awaited prosecution. During the court proceedings, the judge set Jonathan's bail at an extraordinary $1 billion, a figure that was largely symbolic given the seriousness of the charges. His defense attorney argued that the confession should be suppressed, claiming Jonathan had not knowingly agreed to be questioned without legal representation. His fiancée also stood firmly behind him, insisting he was incapable of murder and maintaining that Stephanie had willingly been with him before someone else committed the crime. Prosecutors announced they intended to seek the death penalty, but before the case reached trial, they offered Jonathan a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty, the death penalty would be removed from consideration. Jonathan accepted the deal in September 2007. The agreement required only that he admit guilt rather than explain exactly what happened that night. Even so, he addressed Stephanie's family in court and apologized for her death. Her loved ones rejected his apology completely, saying they believed none of it and urging the judge to impose the harshest sentence possible. Ultimately, Jonathan was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, making him eligible to apply for parole after serving 16 years. His first parole hearing came in 2023, but the board denied his release, leaving him behind bars for the time being. Still, he remains eligible to seek parole again in the future, something Stephanie's father and those closest to her have vowed to oppose every time. Sadly, Stephanie's mother passed away from cancer 8 years after the conviction. To preserve Stephanie's memory, her hometown later dedicated a small park in her honor, where family members and friends continue gathering to remember the bright young woman whose life was taken far too soon. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Thanks for watching. Let's move on to the next case. A promising graduate student suddenly vanished, prompting police to launch an investigation. In the beginning, there were almost no leads and no obvious explanation for what had happened. But as detectives dug deeper, the case took a shocking turn that completely changed the direction of the investigation. And when the full truth finally came to light, it was more disturbing than anyone had expected. Shannon Schieber was born on August 8, 1974, in Maryland, and from an early age it was clear she was remarkably gifted. At just 18 months old, she could recite the alphabet both forwards and backwards, and by the age of 3, she had already taught herself to read. She graduated high school with honors before attending Duke University in North Carolina, where she completed a triple major in mathematics, philosophy, and economics in only 3 years. After spending a year working at a financial firm, Shannon decided to continue her education. Her goal wasn't to build wealth for herself, but to use finance as a way to help people facing financial hardship because she deeply believed in fairness and equal opportunity. At 23, she earned a full scholarship to the prestigious Wharton School and relocated to Philadelphia, settling into an apartment near campus while beginning her doctoral studies. Yet Shannon's life wasn't defined by academics alone. She loved staying active, spending her free time swimming, playing lacrosse, and horseback riding whenever she had the opportunity. Then, in the early hours of May 7, 1998, at around 2 a.m., a neighbor living in the same apartment building called Philadelphia police after hearing a woman scream from Shannon's apartment. He described hearing a terrified cry followed by desperate pleas for help. Alarmed, he rushed into the hallway and approached her door, where he could now hear strange choking or gasping sounds coming from inside. He tried opening the door, but it was locked. After knocking repeatedly and getting no answer, he called 911. While waiting for officers to arrive, he went downstairs hoping another resident could help him force the door open. But only a woman answered because her husband was away at work. Within minutes, officers arrived at the building, less than 5 minutes after the emergency call. By then, however, everything had gone completely quiet. They knocked several times, but received no response. Believing there wasn't enough evidence to justify forcing entry, they hesitated. The neighbor insisted the screams had absolutely come from Shannon's apartment, and another resident living below reported hearing loud banging around the same time. Even so, officers suspected the sounds may have come from outside and that the neighbor had simply mistaken their source. The apartment door showed no signs of forced entry and remained securely locked. One officer even stepped outside and shined a flashlight toward Shannon's second-floor balcony, where the curtains were closed and the balcony door appeared shut. After considering everything they had seen, the officers decided they did not have sufficient grounds to break into the apartment and eventually left. Before leaving, they told the neighbors to call again if they heard anything else, and then drove off. The next morning, Shannon was supposed to meet up with some classmates to study for exams. Later that day, she had plans to grab coffee with her brother, but she never showed up to either. Worried, her brother drove over to her apartment. Right away, he noticed the balcony door was open, though the curtains were still drawn. He knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. With no cell phone, he drove over to a friend's place and called his mom. She told him to head back and asked Shannon's neighbors if anyone had a spare key or to try getting in touch with the building manager. So, he went back and started knocking on every door in the hallway, but most people weren't home. The first person to answer was the same neighbor who had called the police the night before. When Shannon's brother explained who he was and why he was there, the man's face immediately changed. He realized something was seriously wrong. He told him about the screams and the call he made to 911 just hours earlier. Together, they rushed to Shannon's apartment and forced the door open. What they saw inside was horrifying. Shannon was lying face down on her bed, completely naked, and it was immediately clear that she was dead. Police handed Shannon's body over to the medical examiners and began combing through the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door, so detectives figured the killer might have gotten in through the balcony. Her place was on the second floor, but there was a tree right next to the balcony that someone could have easily climbed. It even had a metal guard on it, but with enough skill, it wouldn't have been hard to get past. Inside the apartment, there were clear signs of a struggle. Books were scattered all over the floor near the bed, and there were bloodstains on the blanket, the walls, and even out on the balcony. It looked like Shannon had fought back hard and possibly injured her attackers, since the blood trail leading outside seemed to belong to him. On the bed, investigators also found traces of fluid, which they sent to the lab along with the blood sample for DNA testing. Detectives later realized that a few of Shannon's things were missing. The killer had taken a pin, a necklace, her backpack, a camera, and a stack of CDs. The medical examiners determined that Shannon had died from strangulation and also found signs of assault. They discovered someone else's blood on her teeth. Apparently, she'd bitten her attacker hard enough to make him bleed. As for the time of death, the experts estimated it happened just minutes before her neighbor called the police, though it was impossible to pinpoint the exact moment. Still, one thing immediately stood out. When the police came that night, the balcony door was shut, but when Shannon's brother and the neighbor broke in the next morning, it was open. And since the neighbor had heard choking sounds before he even called 911, it meant Shannon was likely already dead by the time officers arrived at her door. In other words, the killer was probably still inside the apartment when police stood just a few feet away and then slipped out afterward. The blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment were both tested, but the DNA belonged to an unknown man who wasn't in any database. Detectives also circulated a list of Shannon's stolen belongings: her pen, jewelry, backpack, camera, and CDs to local pawn shops, hoping the killer might try to sell them. But nothing came up. They even looked into one of Shannon's classmates as a possible suspect, but his DNA didn't match the killer's. Another lead came from Shannon's friends and family. Just 2 days before she died, she told them about a strange man who had followed her on the street. She walked around the block a few extra times to make sure he didn't learn where she lived. Police didn't rule out that this could have been her killer, but the tip didn't bring them any closer to finding him. From that point on, the investigators hit a dead end. For months, there were no major developments, and detectives were no closer to finding the person responsible. That changed nearly a year later when the case suddenly took a strange new turn. A man called the Philadelphia Inquirer, a local newspaper, claiming to have information about Shannon's murder. He wouldn't give his name, but said the police had completely missed something crucial. The case, he insisted, was connected to several other attacks on women that had happened in the same area. The journalists decided to look into it And sure enough, they found that a series of eerily similar crimes had been taking place right in the heart of Philadelphia. On June 20th, 1997, a year before Shannon's murder, a man broke into a woman's apartment through a window and attacked her. He tried to force himself on her, but she managed to talk him out of it. As soon as he left, she called the police and even handed over a strand of his hair that had fallen on her bed. But for some reason, the police never sent it to the lab for testing. 3 weeks later, on July 11th, another woman came home from a party after drinking quite a bit. She fell asleep right away. But a few hours later, she woke up to find that all her clothes were gone and her hair was soaking wet. She also had scratches on her neck and burst a blood vessel in her eyes. She reported it to police, but they labeled it as a burglary. Then on August 6th, yet another woman was attacked in her apartment. A man climbed in through a window, covered her head with a pillow, wrapped a belt around her neck, and assaulted her before fleeing. Investigators recovered DNA from the bedsheet. But since there wasn't yet a national FBI DNA database, they didn't compare it to other cases. A week later, on August 13th, a woman woke up to find a stranger standing in her bedroom. He assaulted her and took off. This time, police collected DNA again. Investigators used that to create a composite sketch, and when they finally compared it to the previous case from August 6th, it turned out to be an exact match. All of these women lived close to one another, some even on the same street. But for reasons that still baffle people to this day, police didn't classify most of these incidents as assaults. So, there was never a full investigation. As reporters dug deeper, they found that this wasn't just a fluke. It was common practice within the Philadelphia Police Department at the time. A huge number of rape reports weren't officially recorded as crimes. Many officers simply didn't believe the victims. In fact, some senior officials openly claimed that half the women who report rape are lying. Eventually, the newspaper ran a story that blew the whole thing wide open, and it sparked a massive public outcry. The backlash forced police to review every assault report that had never been classified as a crime. And in the process, they ended up reclassifying around 1,500 cases. The article also devoted significant attention to Shannon's murder, pointing out what now seemed like an obvious connection between her case and the earlier assaults, and calling out the police for failing to link them sooner. When Shannon first moved to Philadelphia for college, she'd chosen that apartment specifically because the neighborhood was considered safe. But neither she nor her neighbors had any idea that a serial predator was operating right under their noses, largely because police hadn't recognized the pattern in his attacks. After the article's release, investigators were forced to change their approach completely. Up until then, they'd focused mostly on the idea that Shannon's killer might have been someone she knew, perhaps an ex-boyfriend. But now, they compared the DNA from her murder to the samples taken from the assault cases, and the results were unmistakable. They belonged to the same man. Still, the detectives had no clue who he was. They didn't even have a name. But there was one promising lead. One of the assault victims had seen her attacker's face and given police a description months earlier. Investigators used that to create a composite sketch, which they distributed to local newspapers, along with an announcement of a $40,000 reward for any information leading to the suspect's capture. The calls started pouring in, but every single lead hit a dead end. That went on until September 13th, when the attacker struck again, this time targeting another woman in the same area. He assaulted her, but once again managed to slip away before police could catch him. Not long after, one of the detectives working Shannon's case happened to catch a TV episode about investigators who'd solved a crime using something called geographic profiling. The idea was simple, but interesting. Experts analyzed the location of crimes committed by the same offender and used that pattern to pinpoint where he's most likely living. The team reached out to the same specialists featured in that show, and he put together a map highlighting the areas where their suspect might be based. Detectives hid those neighborhoods, plastering flyers with a composite sketch and talking to residents, but none of it led anywhere. After that, the attacks suddenly stopped. For months, there wasn't a single new report, and detectives started to think the man who terrorized the city had finally gone underground. That pattern continued until the middle of 2000, when detectives noticed a request that had come in from their colleagues at the Colorado Police Department. Investigators there had sent out a nationwide bulletin about a string of sexual assaults that had taken place in the city of Fort Collins, nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. The moment the Philadelphia team saw the report, something clicked. The attacker's methods were nearly identical to those of their elusive killer. He broke into apartments where women were home alone, assaulted them, and then vanished. What's more, he left behind several DNA samples and a fingerprint. Investigators in Philadelphia asked for those samples to be compared with the ones recovered from Shannon's apartment, and the results came back as a perfect match. Their killer had moved clear across the country and kept attacking women. For the first time, police finally had a real shot at uncovering his identity. They decided to dig into credit card transaction data from both sets of crimes, the ones in Philadelphia and Fort Collins, hoping to find people whose cards had been used in both cities around the time of the assaults. It wasn't an easy task, but after combing through thousands of records, they narrowed it down to a list of 319 men between the ages of 20 and 30 whose cards had been active in both places during the attacks. Then, using the geographic profiling map, they focused on certain Philadelphia neighborhoods where the suspect was likely to have lived, shrinking that list even further down to just 83 names. They sent that narrowed list over to their colleagues in Colorado, who started checking whether any of those names might be connected to the assaults. But before they can make progress, the attackers struck again. Not long after, a letter arrived at the same police station. It read, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you catch me just yet. I'm not in Colorado anymore. I didn't even like it there. I'm not a fan of the cold, and I don't plan on coming back to Fort Collins. I have to admit, you guys are everywhere. I want you to catch me because I hate what I'm doing. It keeps me away from people and I don't have anyone to talk to. Sometimes I get really lonely." The letter also included details about several assaults that only investigators would know about, confirming it had been written by the attacker himself. Still, there were no fingerprints or DNA anywhere on it. Detectives believed the letter was meant to throw them off, that maybe he was lying about leaving Fort Collins. But even with that theory, they were no closer to catching him, and time was running out. The biggest issue was the statute of limitations for sexual assault in Pennsylvania. Just 5 years. The first known attacks dated back to 1997, which meant police had less than 2 years left to bring justice to Philadelphia victims. Even though the murder of Shannon Schieber would carry a life sentence or worse, no matter when he was caught, detectives kept reaching out to the public for help. And over the course of the investigation, they got thousands of calls. And finally, in 2002, one tip finally stood out. A woman called them and said the composite sketch of the suspect looked a lot like her ex-boyfriend, a man named Troy Graves. That immediately caught detectives' attention because his name was already on their list of 83 possible suspects. But that wasn't all. Not long after, another call came in. This time from a man who'd said he'd seen the description of the suspect's car, one that had been spotted by a victim. He told police his neighbor drove the exact same type of vehicle, and that his neighbor's name was again Troy Graves. When detectives started digging into his background, The pieces began to line up. Troy had worked at a bank located right in the same Philadelphia neighborhood where all the attacks took place. In 1999, right around the time the crime suddenly stopped, he enlisted in the Army. Not long after, he got written up for trying to force his way into a woman's room, though he denied it ever happened. Troy was stationed in Wyoming, but actually lived just across the state line in Fort Collins, Colorado, so he had lived in both cities where the attacks had occurred. When investigators tracked down his ex-girlfriend, she told them something else unsettling. Troy often went out for night walks and would come home with scratches and bruises he couldn't explain. To top it off, Troy's blood type matched the one found at Shannon's crime scene. Everything pointed to him as their guy. So, detectives decided it was time to talk to him. They went to his house, but he wasn't at home, and one of them slipped a business card into the door. Later, Troy's wife, the woman he'd been married to for about a year, found the card and called the detective back. She said her husband was currently on a military base, but she'd speak to him about the message. Troy agreed to meet with police, but detectives didn't want to take any chances. They sent undercover officers to quietly keep tabs on him, just in case he tried to run. Eventually, Troy showed up at the station, and detectives started with usual routine questions. They noted he had no criminal record, asked him about the incident in the Army that got him written up, and then moved on to the assaults in both cities and the murder of Shannon Schieber. Troy denied everything, but when the detectives asked him to provide his fingerprints and a DNA sample, he went completely silent for about 6 seconds. Then, he said he'd be willing to do it, but only after talking to his wife first. He promised to come back and give the samples the next day. At that point, the detectives told him he was under arrest. Officers immediately took his fingerprints and DNA, and when the results came back, they were a perfect match to the blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment, as well as all the other evidence from the assaults in both Philadelphia and Colorado. On April 23rd, Troy Graves was charged with 6 counts of sexual assault in Colorado, 27 charges in total. A few days later, prosecutors in Pennsylvania filed roughly 50 additional charges tied to the crimes committed there, including the murder of Shannon Schieber. As the investigation continued, several startling revelations came to light. One of Troy Graves' former girlfriends admitted she had recognized him from the composite sketch shown on the news long before investigators identified him as the suspect. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, she never contacted police. Detectives also uncovered another astonishing fact. In January 1999, while authorities were actively searching for Shannon's killer, Philadelphia officers had actually pulled Troy over during a routine traffic stop. After a brief conversation, they let him drive away, never realizing the man they had been hunting was sitting right in front of them. At the same time, prosecutors had to determine which state would try him first. Colorado was prepared to prosecute him for multiple sexual assaults, carrying decades behind bars, while Pennsylvania intended to pursue murder charges that could result in the death penalty. Before a decision was reached, Troy informed his attorney that he was willing to confess to every crime if prosecutors agreed to remove capital punishment from the table. Eventually, both states accepted the agreement. Before approving the plea deal, prosecutors met with Shannon's parents to hear their views. They made their position unmistakably clear. They opposed the death penalty under every circumstance. Even if Troy had refused to confess, they believed taking another human life would violate their deeply held religious convictions, regardless of the unimaginable pain they had endured. Prosecutors also consulted the women who had survived Troy's attacks in both Philadelphia and Fort Collins, and every one of them supported the decision to avoid seeking execution. Shannon's parents also raised a painful point that went beyond their own loss. They believed that if law enforcement had treated the earlier sexual assault reports with the seriousness they deserved, investigators would have recognized a serial predator much sooner, potentially preventing Shannon's murder altogether. Much of the public, however, struggled to understand their position. Many questioned why they wanted to spare the life of the man responsible for their daughter's death. Despite the criticism, Shannon's parents never changed their stance, and the plea agreement ultimately moved forward. As part of that deal, Troy gave investigators a detailed account of the night Shannon was killed. He admitted climbing onto her balcony and entering the apartment while she was in her bedroom. Startled by the intruder, Shannon fought back fiercely, scratching his face and biting his finger. According to Troy, that was when he wrapped his hands around her neck and began strangling her until she lost consciousness. Believing he had broken her neck, he thought she was already dead. A short time later, he heard someone knocking at the apartment door, but claimed the people outside never identified themselves as police officers. He also insisted he never noticed any patrol cars when he escaped through the balcony. Even so, investigators found parts of his confession difficult to reconcile with the evidence. Troy claimed he had closed the balcony door behind him before leaving, yet Shannon's brother clearly remembered finding it standing open the following morning. Despite those inconsistencies, there was no doubt about his responsibility. His DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene, the physical evidence aligned with the investigation, and his confession reinforced what detectives had already proven. On May 17, Troy Graves was sentenced to life in prison in Colorado for 6 sexual assault convictions. He was then extradited to Pennsylvania, where he received another life sentence for Shannon's murder, along with an additional 60 to 120 years for the series of sexual assaults committed there. Barring an extraordinary legal development, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Shannon's family, however, the fight didn't end with his conviction. Her father filed a lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department, arguing that if detectives had properly connected the earlier assaults and recognized the pattern sooner, Shannon might still be alive. The courts ultimately ruled that the department could not be held legally responsible, and no officers faced consequences. Even so, the case sparked widespread public outrage, prompting city officials to establish a special committee tasked with reviewing hundreds of sexual assault reports that had previously been ignored or improperly handled. Shannon's parents continued advocating against the death penalty, traveling across more than 20 states to share their message. Her mother even expressed a desire to meet Troy in prison and speak with him face to face, although it has never been confirmed whether that meeting ever occurred. Today, Troy Graves remains incarcerated with virtually no chance of ever being released. If this case left an impression on you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this documentary, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more true crime stories.